Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Adrian Tolson, owner of 2050 Marine Energy and also Vice Chair of the International Bunker Industry Association. Adrian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Well, let's talk a little bit about just a generic question of a trend that we've really seen, which has been pretty consistent, really, that, and maybe it's not so new to the shipping sector because it's always dealing with changing trade flows. But we have seen since the start of the Ukraine-Russia war in particular, and moving into the Middle East and the Gulf, etc., a lot of redirection of oil flows in general. And by all accounts, seeing the shipping sector adjust accordingly, as it has always done historically. But tell me, what do you think that the impact has been on the bunkering sector? I mean, has it adjusted fully at this stage? Is it something that it absorbed very easily, or did it cause a bit of turbulence in the interim?
Well, yeah, you're right to say that these things happen all the time, right? We've seen every time there's a sort of geopolitical shift or any major event, it impacts shipping and therefore it impacts the bunkering activity. I think obviously when you get a sudden shock like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that does create an immediate reaction. And there was an immediate reaction, not only to obviously initially it was price related, as we know, all the oil markets shot up, but then afterwards it was adjusting to sanctions regimes, either actually enforced or even self-imposed sanction regimes that certain countries and companies set themselves as a result of this. So it did shift things dramatically in terms of bunkering activity, particularly in the Mediterranean, where, Russia out of the Black Sea had been a major supplier into that region, and suddenly there was alternative fuels were required and alternative sources. And obviously, Russia had also been a major supplier into the ARA, the Amsterdam, Rotterdam,
Yes.
Antwerp area, and that was obviously a massive shift because there was no more oil coming out of the Baltic there, as far as that was concerned. So, yeah, bunker demand shifted, and particularly mostly in the European sense. And then, of course, it did then generate. We saw sort of declines, and then it did generate a shift of product moving in the direction of Asia. As the sanctions took place, as some of the sanctions regimes didn't really apply as much in terms of Asian countries, you saw more demand pick up in
Yes.
Asia, shifting of demand. So, to a certain degree, it's enhanced the Asian bunkering situation in countries like India or countries, even aspect of Singapore, or certainly into China as well, for various obvious reasons. So that's
And I
been.
mean, absolutely. As you said, Russian fuels were diverted. And I mean, as talk around a ceasefire, continues between Russia and Ukraine, and who knows when that's going to really stick or take place even. But let's assume that we have an end to these hostilities, would you see those trends into Asia, for example, reversing? Would you see us just carrying on as usual? How do you think that might impact Russian flows if Russia and Ukraine reach some kind of peace agreement?
Well, it depends how quickly the sanctions get lifted and how quickly Europe or indeed the US lift sanctions, I think. And so that would have it could have, if it was suddenly we were great friends again, then it could have dramatic input. But I just don't see that coming that fast. I think it will take some time. And also, just as trade flows have been established for oil trade flows have been established already, and different countries have found alternatives and ways to go around the lack of Russian oil, lack of Russian crude, lack of Russian LNG, for example. Then I think you're equally going to see that the bunker industry has found ways to deal with it, and so it will take some time to shift back. Generally, I think that's probably where we are. I think more dramatic would be, suddenly in a peace accord with. I mean, I did sort of speculate at the beginning of the Trump administration, what happens if we suddenly have some agreement, not only with Russia, but with Venezuela and with
Yeah.
Iran? and what would it do to the oil markets, and how would it change the bunker business? It would be quite significant. And we used to get a lot of, certainly in North America, where I'm based in Boston, we used to get a lot of Venezuelan fuel oil coming into this market that would supply this market and sustain a lot of the bunker industry. Equally so, Iranian fuel oil sort of gets traded in the Arabian Gulf. It gets distributed around the world. But if it's suddenly available for people to use for bunker fuel, I think it would be a very different world we would live in. And so certain place markets have become quite cheap again. Of course, much more
Yeah.
price much more discounted, and it would change bunkering habits to a certain degree.
Okay, great. I mean, and of course, we're still talking really about traditional fuels there, but let's talk a bit about sort of new alternative fuels, cleaner fuels, the trend towards that across the board in the energy sector, really. But fuels like methanol and ammonia that are being, tipped to be in use much more as time goes forward. Even LNG bunkering is out there as a potential proposal. I mean, realistically, from an infrastructural point of view, how close are we to really, I mean, whether it's repurposing ships or actually loading, from a loading infrastructure point of view, how soon do you think we could see that alternative fuel market really take off?
This is a classic chicken and egg discussion that's been going on for a while, and I was commenting sort of on the recent IMO uh,
Hmm. And we'll talk about
regulation
that. Yes,
that was coming out, and we can touch on that in a moment.
yes.
But one of the things about that is that the egg might be slowly starting to hatch, right? So the reality is that I think we will see alternative fuels come obviously once it makes financial sense for people to invest in them on a long-term basis. And I think that also means ship owners primarily first, I think, driving the demand and then going to the market and saying we need these alternative fuels because we're gonna build this many ships because we can't afford to buy fossil fuels anymore because in X number,
Mm.
whatever year it is, 2035 or 2030 or whatever, it's going to be so incredibly expensive. And so that will kick in demand to a certain degree. But the reality of where we are is we're not doing very well right now, to be honest with you. And of course, the IMO work of a couple of weeks ago needs to work its way through the system. But we have sort of fallen behind where our goals would have been, certainly in terms of getting alternative fuel supply out there. And it is a challenge if you look at something as well developed as LNG,
Mm.
which has been around as a bunkering fuel for some time, and LNG continues to be touted as a very good prospect, and certainly with the introduction of bio LNG can have a minimum or low greenhouse gas impact. The reality is that we don't see much investment. What we see is a lot of export investment, export terminals, but very few of those are set to load bunker barges or LNG bunker barges. They're not designed to load small vessels. So that limitation on those export facilities means that, for example, I deal in the United States, that we have enormous amounts of LNG bunker facilities, built in the Gulf Coast in the last few years. None of those can load an LNG bunker barge at the moment. So that's why we haven't seen an LNG bunker facility develop really at this moment in the US Gulf.
And some
So all
people,
this takes time.
yeah,
And
and I mean, LNG bunkering, I said it's an obvious one, but a lot, I mean, in the commentary I've heard in the past is that, I mean, is it still a risky from a physical point of view in terms of explosives? Is it still considered a risky bunkering fuel, or has that been resolved really, in
Well,
that sense?
it isn't. Let's put it this way: there is a lot of safety required because you're dealing with a gas, and it's a little more
Yeah.
difficult. It's cryogenic gas too. So, in other words, there are some issues involved in safety, but I don't think. I mean, we've had LNG bunkering for a long period of time, and it's been successfully done, and it's regularly done at this moment. Obviously, now, as far as bunkering is concerned, regularly done in both Rotterdam and Antwerp, and also obviously in Singapore. So, I think it's proven to be effective. I don't think that's the safety issues. I mean, there are some locations
Mm.
where safety is still out there, where the history and reputation of natural gas has got somewhat
Yes.
negative. I think that's largely dissipated.
Okay, I mean, Adrian, you mentioned the IMO because they did have a meeting, didn't they, a couple of weeks ago, and are due, I think, again to meet in October to sort of get agreement on the 2050 target, of decarbonizing shipping. We had the reports of the US sort of throwing a spanner in the works a couple of weeks ago at that meeting, not attending and saying, no, 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 we can't agree to this, it's just not economical, etc. I mean, perhaps that wasn't a surprise. Do you think that was a setback? And how challenging is it for all these countries to really come to an agreement to set these targets long term for the shipping sector? More challenging than other environmental targets by other sectors, or do you think the shipping has a particular hard time given its global aspect of its operations?
Actually, I'm always impressed by how IMO comes to reach consensus and does carry through on what it says it's going to carry through. I think it's the thing about MEPC and the Environmental Committee of IMO is that it does, every country has, every member signatory has that one vote. So if you get that, I think it's two-thirds majority to agree to something, then it goes forward. And I think we will see this agreement come through in October, basically as is written, and maybe there's a few changes here and there, but I think I mean, there's a lot of devil in the details, of course, of any of these regulations, but I think it will happen. So I think they've done particularly well. I think it will make a difference. The US not being there is a bit of a concern. It's a concern for me, obviously, because I live here. I think, US fleet's not terribly significant. There are definitely aspirations to increase the size of the fleet. So it doesn't really have much of an impact on international shipping, how the other vessels are, how other countries determine whether or not they're compliant with IMO, et cetera. So I think, given the timeline, I think there's a fairly effective piece of legislation or regulation, and I think it will have a significant impact on our industry without doubt.
Okay, and we had somebody actually on our show recently who we were talking about shipping and new fuels, and within the context of Europe, because that's kind of quite ahead in its sort of ambition, but that actually they were saying that even at the right price, there's just the supply of biofuels, for example, isn't even keeping up with what the demand would be. So it's kind of, as you said, the chicken and egg. But is it a catch-up situation to an extent at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, obviously, in a chicken and egg, there's always going to be there's a shortage of demand and there's a shortage of supply. That's the nature of the discussion, right? I think the biofuels thing is a little more complicated because, well, any fuel that depends on a biomass feedstock is going to be challenged, right? Because a lot of other industries, not to mention SAF, which has got a lot of attention, right? Safe
Yes.
aviation fuel, is is going to draw biomass away from that. So it is going to make it more difficult for the biomass that's available to be used for bunker fuels. Um, and I do think we're going to run into supply problems for that reason. And we also have challenges right now because bio's got drawn into a bit of into the trade war in the sense that now we're seeing there's going to be essentially saying you're going to have tariffs on biomass exports, for example, out of China or other
Yes.
locations into the United States, for example. So there is a real challenge in getting enough biomass into the production facilities so that we can produce it. But having said that, I think the demand is there. The path is real. It's a short, medium-term path. I don't think, anybody thinks biofuels will be the main fuel for shipping somewhere in 2040 or 2045. That's just not realistic. But a contributor, yes,
Okay.
obviously very important in the picture, yeah.
And you mentioned the U.S. trade war, the tariffs. Obviously, a dynamic situation there. I mean, how much it's impacting things already, isn't it? It's impacting trade. It's impacting ships loading of Chinese, for example, vessels that were due to would have been heading towards the U.S., for example, West Coast, etc. How disruptive has that been in the last 2 months, let's say, maximum, to actual bunker fuel trade, like literally day by day, and
Yeah,
pricing?
I don't think it's been massively impactful in the actual bunker market so far. I mean, there is lots of anecdotal discussions about, obviously we've seen a burst of shipping activity trying to avoid the tariffs, and that's now unwinding itself. So we're starting to get reports of less container activity, less activity at ports, which I think is valid. But in terms of how it's reflected in the bunkering, it's a bit early yet to give it any. a real impact. It will obviously organization, and if containers are somewhat limited, then that's a bit of a going to be limited in their activity. That's going to be a challenge, and so any interruption to the free market flow of goods is going to be put bad for our industry, right? I think also one of the implications that people don't think about in terms of North America or the US is obviously a lot of the fuels that are supplied in the US don't actually come from the US, right? So they are imported in. We get a lot of Mexican fuel oil supplied in this market, Canadian fuel oil supplied in this market. Believe it or not, the only LNG bunker operation that's really active on the west coast of the Americas right now is supplied out of Canada into Los Angeles. So that's going to be an industry, you have no idea if tariffs come on that, 10%, whatever it might be. We don't quite know how the energy tariff's going to work out. All of that's going to impact the supply picture within North America. So those tariffs are having a lot of impact in this market for sure.
Of course. I mean, this uncertainty must be a very, very big challenge for planners, I suppose, and people planning ahead in terms of costs and purchases. The other sort of impact we've seen come out of the States in terms of the Trump's rhetoric on tariffs and trade and particularly towards China, and which impacts bunkers ultimately is shipbuilding, new shipbuilding. You see China, which obviously is a base for, I don't know, is it 70% of new ships being built globally or something like that? Excuse my numbers, they're not correct. And of course, the US now beginning to sort of put restrictions on that and or at least putting investors off perhaps making those commitments. How serious do you think that is? And will we see a backlog as a result in a year or so because of that? And there's already hesitancy to build new ships, maybe for a different reason. So this can't be helping.
No, it's not. I mean, I think from a shipping point of view, it must be a very difficult world to difficult a ship owning point of view, it must be a difficult world to work with right now. I think from my perspective, and from a bunkering point of view, it has less of an impact. What it has an impact on is it will tend to disrupt calls. It's a bit hard to say at this moment how that regulation works out in terms of, essentially tariffing or shipping from another country ships that are built in China. So I think it's a little hard to say how that all develops. But if some of the initial indications come out, it would tend to make you feel that shipping will reduce the number of calls at US ports. There'll still be cargo to move. Obviously, it may be less cargo because of tariffs generally, but they'll bring more ships into the bigger ports. So from a bunkering point of view, it may cause a concentration of activity in certain supply ports, and other ports may just get missed out. So it may not, some of them, the small, medium-sized ports may become sort of marginalized in the process. The big impact, of course, from, particularly one of the biggest container companies obviously coming into this country is COSCO, which is the Chinese-owned, Chinese-built tonnage. And I think that has a major impact on how COSCO operates. Whether or not that means they put more business into Canada, I don't know, those sort of things into Mexico. But again, it's more difficult because you still have to cross the border, so there would be still tariffs there.
Absolutely. I mean, I sit here in the Gulf, in the Arabian Gulf, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about sort of the future of bunkering here. Fujairah is obviously a very big port that is expanding its facilities for bunkering and other fuels as well. The crude sort of market is beginning to take off a little bit there. It's got VLCCs and anyway, a lot of ambitious investment happening and one or two other ports in the region. Do you see any particular trend developing or growth in the Gulf for bunkering beyond what we've seen already? Any reasons why that would be required, given where we're located?
I think it's fairly secure in the sense there's not dramatic ups and downs in the market in terms of volumes. If you look at the whole, look at the Emirates as one supply location. I think I estimated it's around 12 or 13 million tons total of, that's between Dubai and Sharjah and Fujairah, those locations. So I think that it will continue to be a very significant supply location. I think it will be challenged in the alternative fuel space because I just don't know long term how those commitments go. It is obviously an area of fossil fuel production, right? Fossil fuel, crude oil and LNG. So I think it'd be focused more heavily in that. I don't see it yes, we might see some ethanol and ammonia and things like that, but I doubt bio. I
Yeah.
mean, I joked at a recent event, I said, if you look out the window, you don't see a lot of biomass out there. So the chances of having a lot of bio in this market are somewhat limited. So all these things are pushing against it to a certain degree. But I think as a location where you can get very competitively priced fossil fuels, very competitively priced LNG, there's no question it continues to be play a prominent role for sure.
I mean, and what would you identify, Adrian, as sort of looking forward further ahead a bit more, let's say a 10-year outlook or more, or through to 2020, 2030, I should say, and beyond? I mean, are there any trends out there from a technology point of view or otherwise that you see sort of disrupting the marine fuel market beyond what we know already? I mean, obviously not what we know already, but where would you say there's a lot of power behind any new trends that might propel us into a whole new area of growth in this market, in this sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some impacts out there that there are a lot of major impacts that could impact the marine fuel business. I mean, you know, where we are one of the obvious ones is things like nuclear power for that perspective. And if it really takes hold, and it doesn't have to take hold in the next 5 to 10 years, it may take 20 or 30 years, that will change. It's a complete game changer because suddenly ships won't require to take fuel anymore. So that's a sort of existential crisis for the existing industry. I think there are other things out there. The role of carbon capture in terms of shipping can ships they can ships install carbon capture on board their vessels that can limit the amount of that can allow them to continue to burn high greenhouse gas emitting fuels, but capturing the carbon. It won't happen obviously on long voyages, but on short, medium term voyages, it could be very significant. So those are things that could really change the industry and make it have a big impact on us. I think also there are a lot of other sort of issues out there that could be considered sort of existential for the industry. But I think if you look at fundamental shifts and fundamental changes, one of the biggest ones I think we have to cast is how do we deal with the dollar and the dollar impact and the financial impact of um, of these alternative fuels, and how do we process our industry? I mean, there is going to be a lot more money involved in the industry. If you double the price of low sulfur fuels, or you double the price of fuels by putting levies on them, or as it is not called a levy, but at least a credit trading system, then how do you finance those fuels? And I think that becomes a big issue.
Adrian Tolson from 2050 Marine Energy and Vice Chair of IBIA. Thanks so much for joining us there on Halftime Talk. It's been great to get your perspective on the sector.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.